The Elephant Road, Chapter 12. By tradition, Grandpa's devadla, the cloth that wrapped him when he was a newborn, must now be returned to Himmendal, the village where Grandpa was born. It was far away on the other side of the province, and with No to care for and so much work to be done in the village, neither mother nor father could be away. So father's good idea was that Dengu and Wyland should make the journey. All the family agreed that this was a fine plan. So 2 days after they had sprinkled Grandpa's remains on the wet earth, Wyland and Dengu were getting off a bus after 12 long hours of winding around hairpin bends and avoiding beeping lorries. Wyland looked around. Gray clouds drifted like rags over the hills, and a group of houses, built of brick and flattened tin cans, huddled from the wind. On the horizon, tall chimneys smudged the clouds darker with their smoke. There were no people to be seen anywhere, and no trees, just dead yellow grass and the little sad house crouching under the dull sky. A rusted sign saying Himmendale showed that they were in the right place, in spite of this unpromising appearance. Wyland shivered. Was this really where Grandpa had grown up? Dengu zipped up his biker jacket. Well, let's get this done, shall we? They knocked on the door of the only house that showed any sign of life. A thread of smoke came up from its chimney. A high, wobbly voice called out, "Go away." Dengu knocked again. "Go away," the voice said, sounding even higher and more wobbly. Sorry to disturb you, ma'am," Dengu called out, "but I am the youngest son of Jenak Achingitak Arang." Willen had never heard his grandfather's full name said out loud before. It sounded strange to him, but it worked like a charm on the owner of the wobbly voice. The iron door scraped open, and a tiny old lady stood before them, as fragile as a bird. She looked up intently into Dengu's face. "I can see that you are Jenak's boy," she said. "But who is this?" And she poked Wyland in the chest with a trembling and very dirty finger. "My sister's son," Dengu replied. "Jenak's grandson." "Ah," she said. "Well, you better come in." She gave the most enormous sigh, and Wyland thought that he had never seen a person more tired. The old lady hobbled down a dark corridor into a small cave-like room, lit with a single light bulb and the flicker of a wood fire. On the floor stood a blackened pot of cooked rice in a spoon. Dengu and Wyland exchanged a look. It was clear that she hadn't eaten anything but rice in a long time. The old lady sat down onto a chair and pointed to a low bench. "Sit there," she told them, "but put another log on the fire first. They're too heavy for me to lift more than one a day." Dengu did as he was told. Wyland watched the log settle into flames. It was a section cut from a huge old tree. No one in Umanamara had ever cut down trees that big just to burn. And no old lady in Umanamara would be on her own all day with nothing to eat but cold rice. The old lady sighed again and looked into the fire. "I guess why you're here. He's dead, isn't he?" Dengu answered, "Yes." It sounded as if that answer, yes, had scalded his throat. "And you've come to bring his devadala to his mother's village?" Dengu nodded. "Yes, we'd like to find," but the old lady cut him off. "Find his relatives? They're all dead, or they've moved away long, long ago. But I'll take the cloth for you. I knew him when we were young." Silently, Dengu pulled out the devadala and put it into her hands. It seemed impossible that a person as large as Grandpa had once fitted into this tiny piece of fabric. The old lady took the devadala and rubbed it against her face. Then she folded it carefully and tucked it inside her jacket. "Come," she said, "there's something you should see." The old lady told them to call her Ambi. She looked so small and alone as she led them across the bare, windy hillside, down a stony track, It was a slow progress, as walking clearly was hard for her. But at last they reached a hollow, and in it stood one enormous old tree. Amby beckoned them close to it and leaned her back against the trunk, and she shut her eyes and said, "And now I have a story to tell you. This tree is the very last tree of our forest. When I was a girl, all these hills were covered in green forest and hum fields. Himmendal was a lovely place. It was a village in the forest and the home of many families. All that you see now was trees and green hum fields." Wyland looked around stunned. Millions of trees must once have covered these sad yellow hills. How many gibbons and elephants and birds and deer had lived here? A forest was a whole world. Until this moment, Wyland hadn't understood how a whole world could disappear so entirely. Would Amara look like this one day? He shivered to think. Dengu stood between the tree's great roots, his face pinched and pale, and he stared at the bare hills as if it hurt him to look at them. Amby went on. "The forest gave us wood to build, medicines to heal, and animals to eat. It brought rain to fill our rivers and water for our crops. But little by little, we cut it down to grow more crops, to mine for gold, and to make money." Amby touched Dengu's arm and looked into his stricken face. "Your father, Jenak," she told him, "he warned us. The coal will run out," he said. "The soil will lose its goodness, and no rain will come. He warned us, and he warned us. But he was only young, and no one would listen. And one day, all the forest was gone. The coal did run out, and the soil did die, and the rains did fail, just as he said. People had to leave, and now there's nothing and nobody, just me here and this old tree." Then she opened her eyes and said, "That is all I have to say." And here's a picture of them by the big tree, and they're leaning against it. The bus drove on through the night. Wyland was exhausted. He could have slept standing up in the aisle. From time to time, he woke and found Dengu staring wide-eyed at the black window. He loved his uncle still, but now Wyland knew that he must try to win the fight that Grandpa had lost. As they got off the bus the next morning in Tura, Wyland pulled out the paper money that had been burning in his pocket ever since Dengu had given it to him and thrust it back into his uncle's hands. Chapter 13. When Wyland got back to Umanamara, there were just 4 more days until the big meeting with Mr. Patchap. 4 days for Wyland to find a way to defeat him and to stop Umanamara from turning into a desert of dead grass like Himmendal had. Children and young people were staying home to help with the cyclone repairs, so there was lots of time to listen to the village talk. Lots of time to hear that the whole village was leaning like a tree being felled. They were ready to fall into Mr. Patchap's lap and sign away their forest forever. The more he heard people talk about the houses they would build and the motorbikes they would buy with the money that Mr. Patchap's deal would bring, the worse Wyland felt. It seemed unstoppable. It seemed like a cyclone itself. So when Father offered to take him to Tura on a visit to the town council offices to report on the cyclone, Wyland was glad to escape. He sat in the waiting area outside the room where Father was having his meeting. His legs stuck to the plastic chair. Falling half asleep, he began to flick through the pages of the council's newsletter that was lying on the desk. He was hardly paying attention, so he very nearly didn't notice the photo at the bottom of the inside page. But once he saw it, he was wide awake. It showed a tall man in a green uniform shaking hands with a village leader, a village Nokma. And around them, a crowd of smiling school children held tiny seedling trees in pots. And it said, "Nokin Gaba village benefits from a new tree planting. Villagers will be paid to plant and care for trees. Wyland's heart turned like a leaf. What if Unanamara could be paid to plant and care for trees instead of cutting them down? His eyes raked the page to find out more, but there was nothing. A lady sat behind a desk in the corner of the room, blushing and trembling with embarrassment. Wyland carried the newspaper to her. He pointed to the man in the photograph and managed to growl out one word: who? The lady might have ignored this boy that stood in front of her, but she didn't. She was kind, and she smiled and said, "Oh, that's Mr. Chatterjee. His office is on the top floor." Wyland's long legs wobbled. This was an opportunity to get a business associate of his own, one who might offer a real alternative to Mr. Patchap's poisonous deal. Without giving himself the chance to wonder what he would say when he got there or how he would manage to get the words out, Wyland leapt up all 6 flights of stairs, straight to Mr. Chatterjee's door. Mr. Chatterjee might not have been in his office, for he seldom was, but on this particular Tuesday afternoon, when Wyland knocked, as if by a miracle, a voice answered, "Come in." The evening of the big meeting came. Wyland felt sick. While Mother and Auntie Em cooked a load of tapioca root, he cuddled Nona because her little warm body on his chest made him feel a bit calmer. He thought about telling Mother and Father what he had planned, but he knew that a surprise could be powerful. Dengu had taught him that. At last, night came. Pools of lantern light wound up the path across the hillside to Nokma's house. People spoke quietly and politely nibbled at the tapioca root. Everyone was very solemn. Dengu was going to come with Mr. Patchap. People watched out anxiously for the appearance of the big black car, but there was no sign of it. Wyland watched out too, but he was looking for another vehicle altogether. At last, headlights showed up in the darkness, and Wyland's heart leapt. But when Mr. Patchap's monster 4x4 drew into the yard, his heart dropped to the bottom of his chest. How could he fight this battle alone? Mr. Patchap got out and explained that Dengu would be unable to come to the meeting. Mother and Father exchanged looks, but really no one was surprised. Dengu had set up the deal, and now he must have moved on to other things, just like he usually did. The villagers greeted Mr. Patchap eagerly and watched with hungry eyes as he drew official-looking papers from his pocket and laid them on the table, ready for the villagers to sign. The decision had been made. It seemed that no one wanted to even talk about it anymore. After all that they'd lost to the rain, to the elephants, to the cyclone, what choice did they have? Wyland gazed desperately down the track, but there wasn't a glimmer of headlights anywhere. It was now or never. He had to find his voice. His voice kind of squeaked, "I'd like to say something." Mr. Patchap looked up. "Did I hear one of your famous gibbons making a noise?" The man laughed at his own joke, but Wyland noticed that no one else did. That gave him courage. He stood up on a chair so that a small voice could carry further. "No," he growled. "It was me." He saw Father looking at him in astonishment, and Mother smiling back as if she knew he had some lovely secret. She had picked Relip up so that he could see his big brother. Relip, for once, had stopped talking. Patchap stood up then and said, "I don't think we need to listen to the opinions of children." Mother looked sternly at Mr. Patchap and said, "In our culture, everyone's opinion is heard. Carry on, son." Wyland took a deep breath and stopped worrying that his voice swooped in pitch and squeaked. It didn't matter what people thought of him. What mattered was what he had to say. So he shut his eyes tight to squeeze out the nervousness, and then he spoke up. "I went to Himmendal, Grandpa's village," he said as loudly as he could. and everyone had left except one old lady who lived alone with no one to make her fire or cook her dinner. She was the loneliest person I have ever seen. It had gone very quiet. Wyland went on. She showed us a tree. One tree. Just one tree. It was the last tree left out of that forest that had once covered the hills like our forest covers our hills. In her village, my grandfather's village, they cut their trees to grow crops and to mine coal. And even though he was young then, my grandpa warned them what would happen. He told them that the soil would get tired and the coal would run out, and then the money would run out and everyone would have to leave the land. And he was right. No one lives in that village now. No one except one lonely old woman. Wyland took a big breath and opened his eyes. He didn't feel scared anymore. He just wanted everyone to listen. He looked round at all the faces, at all the eyes fixed on him, and then he went on. If we cut down our forest like Mr. Patchap wants, we will lose our elephants, our gibbons, our homes, our food, our rain. And worst of all, we'll lose each other. Dengu had always known how to make a good entrance. He stepped into the silence that Wyland's words had created and started clapping. Well done, Wyland. That was wonderful, nephew. Wyland's heart fell. Handsome, clever Uncle Dengu was about to make a fool of him. But then Wylu saw that his uncle wasn't laughing. In fact, his uncle had tears in his eyes. Since I spoke to you all about the deal with Mr. Patchap here, Dengu said, I've had a change of heart. I've seen that my father was right. I've also found out that Mr. Patchap isn't a very nice man to be in business with. Dengu turned his face to show that his cheek was cut and bruised. This is what Mr. Patchap does to people who disagree with him. The villagers gasped in horror. Mr. Patchap squirmed in his chair. So I am happy to tell you that my clever nephew has found a much better partner for Unamara, said Dengu. I think you should hear what Mr. Chatterjee has to say. Mr. Chatterjee appeared around the end of the shelter. Apologies for my lateness. My Land Rover is stuck a mile down in your track. Dengu was kind enough to give me a lift here on his motorbike. Mr. Chatterjee's accent was unfamiliar. It was hard for the people to understand him at first. He's from Delhi, Dengu whispered to his sister. He can't help but to talk like that. But the villagers were very pleased when they heard what Mr. Chatterjee had to say. Your forest here holds so many animals and plants that it's like a storehouse of treasures. These are valued across India and all across the world. My organization wishes to help you to be guardians of this treasure. Mr. Chatterjee's organization would pay the people of Unanamara to plant trees on old humplots on the mudslide where all the trees have been swept away. It would give them beehives and a chicken house so that they didn't have to cut down more and more and more forest just to earn a living. Everyone was so busy smiling and shaking hands with Mr. Chatterjee and congratulating Wyland that no one had noticed Mr. Patchap, his driver, and his big black shiny car slinking away. There's one more thing, said Mr. Chatterjee, shouting to make himself heard above the excited villagers. It concerns elephants. Everyone immediately fell silent. I know that you have had many problems with elephants. Mr. Chatterjee shook his head sadly and then went on. Unanamara is close to the place where they cross the river, as you know. But if we restore the forest on both sides of that crossing, elephants can travel without the need to stray into the crops and villages and cause a nuisance. We wish to create what we call a green corridor, along which the elephants may travel between the two forest reserves. You could call it, he added with a small smile of his own wit, an elephant road. Grandpa's voice echoed in Wyland's heart. We live on an elephant road between elephant palaces. Those are the exact words his grandpa had used. So that's the end. There's going to be an epilogue, which is like one more chapter that tells what happens next, and then a couple of notes. So I'll read that. Actually, it's not very long. So I know this is a bit of a longer one, but I'll read this next. Wyland helped Silmi on the ladder. He still thought of her as No-No, but at age 7, she got very cross with anyone who called her that. Oh, so now the baby, No-No, is actually 7 years old. Don't be afraid, he told her. I'm right behind you. I'm not afraid, she said. I climb up to this lookout all the time. They reached the lookout and sat at the far end, gazing over the hills and valleys. Tell me about the landslide again, Wyland. Silmi loved to hear stories about the village's most dramatic year. It was right there, from Mother's house down to the valley and over the stream. We planted trees on it, so when you were we planted the trees on it right there when you were 1, so they are almost as tall as this lookout now. It was true. The ugly scar of the cyclone was healed and covered with a young forest full of life. Will the trees we planted today grow that fast? Wyland laughed. By the time you go to high school, this will be a proper forest. And by the time you get married, Silmi punched her brother, there will be gibbons swinging and singing in the treetops. They sat for a moment watching the pink sky and listening to the evening call of birds. You're going tomorrow, aren't you? You know I am, Silmi. I have to go live in my wife's village. It's the tradition, and it's near to college for me and my forestry courses. You're sad to leave, aren't you? Wyland nodded. I'll take care of the forest, you know. You don't need to worry. I'll be the Nokma after Mummy, and I'll plant so many trees. Just wait and see. She squeezed his hand. Look, she said. Among the young trees on the mudslide, 5 elephants were moving, slowly and calmly, with no need to rush. They were walking up Elephant Road to their palace. And that's the end. And then they show, these pictures are not very good because they're in black and white, but there's an elephant there. And then the back talks about how there's an organization that's helping the people who live there. This is a lookout tower for them to look out and see the elephants. And these are some children from the village. And it says, the people who live here love the forest and are very proud of their ability to protect it. In this part of India, their young people want to safeguard the forest because they see it as an essential part of who they are. There are threats to try and take the forest down. So the people are fighting. And there's an organization that is helping called the Wildlife Trust of India. The Wildlife Trust of India. So that's a good charity to support. I hope you liked the story.